Hello and welcome. In this episode we are going to summarize the developments along the front line. We are going to talk about what's going on, and we will talk more about the Russian force generation as well as about the political developments inside of Russia. But let's just start. The Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, has said the Russians are planning a false flag attack on critical infrastructure inside of Belarus to force the Belarusian military to join the war on their side. They specifically mentioned the Ostrovets nuclear power plant, but regardless of what might happen, it seems highly unlikely that the Belarusian military is going to join the war against Ukraine. Not only don't they do any mobilization as of now, they haven't positioned themselves in any offensive way. The military itself is weak and small, and Lukashenko's power would be up for grabs in case he joins. He would face massive local opposition, and it's highly unlikely that he's going to risk his position by joining the war, even after provocation supposedly coming from Ukraine. Also, the Belarusian military has handed over massive amounts of stockpiles of weapons as well as of munitions over to the Russians. Again, not really the ideal preparation if you want to join a war. So whatever the Russians are going to do, if they are going to do something, it seems highly unlikely that they're going to succeed in dragging Belarus into the war. We have fresh missile data from Ukraine. The Ukrainian government is publishing this here, which is the current estimated stockpile by the Russians. You can pause the video and check it up for yourself. We have this, what the Ukrainians think the Russians still have left in ballistic missiles and in cruise missiles and any other long-range missiles that can be used to attack Ukrainian targets. And we have here videos that show us the current situation on the front lines. We see here a Ukrainian T-64 without a barrel that has sunk into the mud more or less up to the turret. We see here the mud situation. You can see it here. It's difficult even to walk, let alone to drive. And as we've just seen, even tanks with wide tracks are sinking completely. That will be an explanation for what we are going to hear soon, that the front lines are still barely moving. Something here, we see a Ukrainian MRAP. This before was from the Russian side. Here, while the road situation isn't that bad, nowhere comparable to what we've initially seen, you see while it moves the MRAP, it basically moves in a direction it intends to, it wants to, not where it's steered at. And here we see more or less the same thing. That's more sliding than driving from this. I think it should be a French supply, yeah, French VAB that is going to be sent here. When we come to the Eastern Front, Ukraine is reporting for a couple of days already that along the Eastern Front line, troops from Kherson are arriving now. So the Russian forces are being strengthened with reinforcements from the troops that were evacuated from the right bank of the river Dnipro. There are still continued fighting at Kuzymivka, which is here. The Ukrainians likely control a part of that town, which the Russians usually call the whole thing Kuzymivka. What we see here on the map, Novoselivske, is, it seems at least from the Russian side, being given the name Kuzymivka as well. And it seems likely that Ukrainians are here in the western part of town and there's ongoing fighting here, but no decision in any way has been done. The Russians also say there has been Ukrainian attacks in Loshchanka and Chervonopopivka, towards those, which is down here. So the Ukrainians are still trying to push towards the, I think it's P66, that road here. The road between Kremina and Svatove, which is still under Russian control and obviously important for the communication of the Russian forces along the front line. Ukrainians are saying there have been Russian attacks from the direction of Kremina into the direction of Liman. They haven't achieved anything, as well as the Ukrainian attacks here don't seem to have achieved anything either. So while the front line is more or less static, there is fighting. There seems to even be heavy fighting in places, but it isn't moving at all. And we've seen indications here why that might be, because it's really difficult to bring in heavy gear heavy weaponry to bring it to the front line and make it support the infantry. And without heavy weaponry, obviously advances are much more difficult. Further south, starting from Bilohorivka, the Russian attacks continue. I could more or less, again, like mention every town here, from Spirne über Bakhmutske, Soledar, Bakhmut itself, Ivangrad, which is here, into the direction of Kishchivka, and down to Avdiivka, etc. The attacks are continuing. There is very little movement along the front line again. We have confirmation that on the eastern outskirts of Bakhmut there is fighting, so both coming from Ivangrad as well as from the east itself. So more or less along that line here is probably fighting. There seems to have been a small Russian success in the direction of Klishchivka. In this direction they have advanced slightly. There's also a small success possible in the direction of Nevelske. That seems likely that they also advanced a little bit in this direction. Other than that, the Russians themselves are claiming they advanced in Marinka. I can't fully confirm that, but it seems fairly likely. And south of it, the actually Ukrainian counterattacks commence in the direction of Slavne, in the direction of Novodonetsk. More or less from what I've seen along that line, Ukrainian counterattacks are happening that try to push the Russians back, but have not achieved any territorial gains from what I found out. So the front line, again, slight advances by the Russians south of the Seversky Donetsk river line here. North of it, the Ukrainians seem to have the upper hand still, but they don't achieve anything, and the Russians don't achieve much, but they seem to gain a little bit of ground south of the Seversky Donetsk. On the southern front here, we have artillery fire along the river. Both sides continue to exchange fire. The Ukrainians are now saying along the river front, along the river itself, the Dnipro, it's mobilized personnel, so the freshly mobilized personnel that is guarding this, and the more experienced units are pulled further back, which actually makes a lot of sense. A serious Ukrainian attempt to cross the river right now seems to be highly unlikely. So mobilized personnel is not highly qualified, but is fairly fresh. They should be more or less enough to deter any Ukrainian amphibious operation over the river. They should be enough. They should have a decent chance to fight some sabotage troops that might cross the river. But this gives the more elite troops that have been fighting non-stop since the end of February on this front line, that gives them respite. They can refresh, they can regroup, they can gather strength again while having them in the rear areas where they are still available in case the Ukrainians are actually trying to get over the river. The Russians are saying a Ukrainian sabotage troop has tried to cross at Dniprovsk, which is here. I cannot confirm this, but they say the Ukrainians tried to cross the Dnipro here and have been defeated. Ukraine actually has now confirmed with the spokesperson Natalia Humenyuk that Ukrainian forces are actually active on the Kinburn Spit here, so on the other side of the Dnipro. But again, they insist on operational silence, so we don't know anything here. We talked about it in the past. It's fairly possible that the Ukrainians achieve an amphibious landing here, but that they develop it to a degree, including bringing over heavy weaponry, that they have a realistic chance of breaking out and threatening the front line along the river from the rear seems highly unlikely, as the area here, as we can see, is swampy, is not really made for heavy weaponry, and of course in that area they can be easily targeted by artillery. The Russians have withdrawn their artillery 15 to 20 kilometers from the Dnipro to avoid being shelled by the Ukrainians, so they more or less give up the chance to shell the rear areas along the front line here. But if you look, the Russians have the Mr. B, which has roughly 29 kilometers of range, and as we can see here, it can at least shell a big portion of the Kinburn Spit if it's on the south of the Yahorlik Bay. So there will be no absolute security from Ukraine, from Russian artillery. If they are here, they might very well be threatened. So I'm highly doubtful we will see this turn into a serious amphibious operation that intends to break out and reach the Crimean. But obviously we can be surprised in the future there. I'm just hesitant as of now, and my stream technician pops up. So please apologize if I, please excuse if I'm going to be distracted a little bit from now on. Further south here, we have in Militopol, we have the reports that civilians are being forced to construct defensive works, fortifications, dig trenches, etc. And we have again a shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. There have been videos done by this. There are pictures, and I actually found here one Russian pro-Russian Telegram channel that is claiming that it was the Russians. So he's accusing his own person, his own people, by looking at the shell damage that he can localize. He's saying the shells have to come from the Russian side, but he's the only one doing that. The rest of the Russian Telegram channels are insisting that it is Ukrainian shelling of the power plant, as we know from the past months now that both sides still insist on the other being the perpetrator here when the power plant is shelled. The good news in this is that the reactors and the fuel storages are undamaged, so the shelling might have been significant in volume. It must have been bigger than in the past. It has not done any damage that is irreversible, that will cause a catastrophe right away. We also have, because in the past on this channel I showed improvised armor by the Russians, now we have an example from the Ukrainian side as well. We can see that here, that should be, at least if I was able to identify it properly, that should be a Ukrainian train that reached Militopol. And now this is not a Russian trucker, truck driver, military truck driver that is bolting steel plates or even trees on his truck to prevent to guard himself from being shot. This is a train now, but we can see that the train crew obviously is careful going to Kherson, which is still in artillery range of the Russians. So they seem to have added some steel plates to the locomotive to give them some protection against splinters at the very least, when in case they should get into a shelling. Okay, let's see if our guy here, nope, please. Sweet. Okay, so when it comes to partisans, we have reports that the FSB has created a special force to identify partisans. It includes specialists, IT specialists that are supposed to analyze internet traffic to identify Ukrainian partisans in their occupied territory. So we see how serious the partisan threat is, that the Russians are now creating special forces just to hunt them down. When we come about the mobilization, we have information about the prison population. Since January this year, the prison population has decreased by 6.5%. In total, there are 23,000 men less incarcerated than there were at the beginning of the year. At the same time, the persons in jail, I think it is, like where you're imprisoned until you are sentenced, those have not declined, which is an indication not of a reduced activity to prosecute, not of a reduced activity to look for criminals, but of an actual decline of the prison population, which would give us some indication of how many likely have joined Wagner units up. And in this case, it would be up to 23,000 that might have joined Wagner in this regard. Good. The Russian Telegram channel, because we said it in the past that there has been a discussion among Telegram channels that Russia might do a general mobilization at the end of the year. This is a Russian military pro-Russian Telegram channel, and it is saying it's impossible. The Russians can't do a general mobilization because they neither have they can't train those, they can't equip those, etc. They're incapable. Even if they wanted to, they can't do a general mobilization. And this is a pro-Russian channel. And he's saying it's more likely that 100 to 200,000 will be called up in consecutive waves, because 100 to 200,000 are more easy to handle. And we can see here in total, he says that according to his estimation, they will need 1 to 1.5 million soldiers to be able to defeat the Ukrainians. Just so we have some number what the pro-Russian Telegram thinks, and we can see here the Ukrainian Nazi junta. So we see the example here to show us which side of the conflict he identifies himself on. Other than that, we have, when it comes to fourth generation, the usual litany of additional videos of complaints by recruits, by mobilized persons themselves, by family members, etc. All of them still calling problems for the lack of training, for the lack of equipment, for maltreatment. And Luhansk, it's reported that there are now checkpoints being set up to catch deserters that are trying to flee from the front. When it comes to the political sphere, the Duma is currently consulting or reading a potential law that would more or less force internet companies to hand over the recommendation algorithms to the government, which in fact would mean that everyone who runs a website that has a search engine has to make sure that the government can decide if certain persons or certain topics are restricted or outright banned. Another sign of the increase of the censorship that is going to getting developed within Russia. And the FSB has now published a decree that is threatening punishment on additional activity, and it can be more or less summarized about providing OSINT about Russian activity. So if I understood it correctly, that would mean you're in danger if you're telling positions, in danger of being punished if you're telling military positions, basically anything that can be used by the opposite side to gain military intelligence on training, on equipment, on tactics, on positions, etc., etc. And when we come to the international support, we have US intelligence informations are being published. I think it was the New York Times again that said that Russia and Iran have agreed to a license production, I would at least call it license production, of Iranian drones inside of Russia. This should allow Russia to increase the amount of drones that are being produced massively, and should allow Russia to not only use more of those suicide drones, those loitering munitions, but it will also allow Russia to claim that it's using Russian drones. So they will avoid the embarrassment of having to say we have to buy drones from Iran. While this is support for Russia, we have support for Ukraine as well. We have here that UK is sending additional Brimstone 2 missiles, but there's also TGLR-230 MRLs that are coming from Turkey. Those are missiles that should have the same caliber and should fit into the M270, which we can see here, and into HIMARS. I'm not 100% sure, but they should fit into those. The interesting part is not only do they have a decent range, but they are also laser guided, so they can attack mobile targets as long as the targets are being lit up with a laser, and that would allow the Turkish Bayraktar inside of the Ukrainian arsenal to basically allow artillery fire at longer ranges against moving targets. Also, the Turks are supplying Ukraine with Sungur infrared guided manpads. I have found it here. That's this system here, and they claim it's the longest range of its class, so 8-kilometer range, 500-meter minimum range, up to 4 kilometers in altitude, and it's fire and forget with lock-on before launch infrared targeting. The interesting part is though that the Turks actually have developed it to a degree and tested it that it can now be used from the Bayraktar, giving the Bayraktar drones, the Bayraktar TB2 drones in Ukrainian arsenal an air-to-air capability. Now this, while this theoretically might allow them to shoot down helicopters and fighter planes, this is obviously meant to shoot down loitering munitions, allowing the Ukrainians to find a more affordable way to combat drones like the Shahed 136. Also, they will receive ground-based electronic warfare equipment and airborne electronic warfare equipment, again here for the TB2 Bayraktar drones. And finally, we have news from Israel. This is an editor-in-chief, the editor-in-chief for Haaretz. This is a left-wing newspaper in Jerusalem, in Israel. I think at least they're in Jerusalem. And he's saying that, and I found several other entries like this, that Israel has now allowed NATO and other nations to deliver Israeli weaponry as a response to Russia's reliance on Iranian weapons. I'm not completely sure this will mean that Iran will actively sell weapons, let's say, to Poland, knowing that Poland will hand them over to Ukraine, so indirectly supplying Ukraine. But if that's true, and I guess we can expect it to be true, then it would mean that at least the stockpiles of Israeli weaponry inside of the European and North American NATO members will be allowed to be handed over to Ukraine to help Ukrainian armed forces. And that would also be an explanation why we've seen Israeli MRAPs recently in the Ukrainian service. And that's it already for now. Rather short today, but there's not that much to say actually, because the front lines, thanks to the Rasputitsa we've seen here, are more or less stable. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did so, this channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. So if you want to support the channel, please do so by the means stated in the description. And thank you very much to everyone already having supported it. Other than that, you can obviously also support the channel by hitting the thumbs up button, by discussing, for instance, what you think when the Rasputitsa is over, what do you think? Do the Ukrainians, will they keep the strategic initiative, and will the operations in the Kinburn Spit actually turn into a full amphibious invasion, into an attempt to cut the lines of communication towards the Dnipro River, as a full attempt to reach the Crimean? All of those discussions are helping with the algorithm, as well as, if you're not subscribed yet, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos, and recommend the channel to your friends and acquaintances to help it grow. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back if I find the outro, because of my little friend here. Okay.